Long after the last pagan temples crumbled into dust, their gods lived on, not in distant myths, but hidden within the sacred spaces that replaced them. Their faces softened, their names altered, their stories reshaped to fit a new narrative. The goddess who once guarded hearth and harvest now wears the robes of a saint. The wild god of the woods, his horns and laughter feared, lurks in the shadows, recast as a demon. And the messengers of older heavens, with wings of fire and voices like thunder, descend once more, but now as angels. This isn't a story of conquest, but of transformation. The divine didn't vanish. It adapted, slipping beneath the surface of a faith that claimed to have vanquished it. The forgotten gods of ancient worlds were never truly forgotten. They were simply renamed. To understand how the old gods faded, or seemed to, you have to start at the beginning, not with their downfall, but with the rise of something new. Christianity began as a fragile, flickering flame, a faith born in the dusty streets of Jerusalem, carried in whispers from one voice to another. It was not the religion of emperors and armies. In its earliest days, it was the faith of the marginalized, the persecuted, the outcast, the hopeful. Fishermen, tent makers, slaves, and scribes met in small, dimly lit rooms, sharing stories of a man who had defied death and promised eternal life. But ideas like seeds don't stay buried, they grow. By the early 4th century, Christianity had spread from the shores of the Mediterranean to the heart of Rome itself. It travelled along the veins of empire, roads carved in stone, trade routes winding across deserts and seas. Then came a turning point, the Edict of Milan in 313 CE. Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity, lifting it from the shadows. Less than a century later, under Theodosius I, Christianity wasn't just tolerated, it was declared the official religion of the Roman Empire. This is where the story changes. Because Christianity wasn't just a faith anymore, it was power, and power doesn't just convert hearts, it conquers. The gods of old, Jupiter, Mars, Isis, Brigid, and countless others, stood in its path. Their temples had towered for centuries, their rituals woven into the fabric of daily life. The common story says Christianity triumphed, sweeping them away like ash in the wind. Temples destroyed, idols smashed, sacred rites outlawed, a clean break, a new order. But history is rarely so simple. The truth is, gods don't die so easily. You can crush a statue, but you can't crush belief. Instead of vanishing, many of these gods survived, not in defiance but in disguise. The sacred groves of the Druids didn't disappear overnight. The oak trees still stood, ancient and defiant. So instead of cutting them down, missionaries sanctified them. The gods weren't eradicated. They were given new names, new roles, new costumes to wear on history's stage. In Egypt, the mother goddess Isis, cradling her infant son Horus, was not forgotten. Her image lived on, mirrored in the iconography of the Virgin Mary and the Christ child. The festivals of Dionysus, god of wine and rebirth, were too beloved to ban, so they were rebranded, their echoes woven into the celebrations of Christian saints. Christianization was not just about conversion, but transformation. The Romans themselves had perfected this art of religious adaptation long before Christianity arrived. When they conquered Greece, they didn't dismantle the Greek pantheon, they simply renamed it. Zeus became Jupiter, Ares became Mars, Hermes became Mercury. Christianity inherited this pragmatic approach. It was easier to absorb than to erase, to sanctify rather than to destroy. Consider the festival of Saturnalia, a raucous Roman celebration of the god Saturn, filled with gift-giving, feasting and role reversals. It was too beloved to abolish, so it was softened, reshaped, and in time its echoes found a new home in Christmas traditions. The date of December 25th, often associated with the birth of Jesus, coincides with the pagan celebration of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. The light of the old gods still flickered beneath the candles of the new. Even the symbols endured. The fish, an ancient pagan symbol of fertility and life, became a secret sign for early Christians. The halo, often seen crowning the heads of saints and angels, was borrowed from depictions of Greek and Roman deities signifying divine radiance. The supposed death of the old gods was less a violent end and more a transformation. Their temples may have crumbled, their names may have shifted, but their essence lingered. Embedded in rituals, etched into stone, whispered in prayers spoken half in fear, half in memory. So did the gods truly die? Or did they find new ways to survive, hidden in plain sight, their faces altered but their presence undiminished? The answer lies not in the ruins of forgotten temples, but in the very heart of the faith that claimed to have vanquished them. But if the old gods didn't die, where did they go? Some found new homes, not in distant myths, but within the very heart of Christianity itself. They were transformed into saints, their sacred attributes carefully repackaged, their festivals rebranded, and their sacred spaces repurposed. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate process, a quiet negotiation between the old and the new, written not with swords, but with stories. Take St. Brigid of Kildare, one of Ireland's most beloved saints. Her legacy stretches back far beyond the arrival of Christianity on Irish shores. Before she wore the mantle of sainthood, Brigid was a goddess. Brigid the Exalted, a figure from Celtic mythology revered as the goddess of fertility, healing, poetry, and craftsmanship. She was associated with fire, both literal and metaphorical, symbolising inspiration and transformation. Her sacred flame burned perpetually in Kildare, tended by priestesses dedicated to her worship. When Christianity arrived, it didn't attempt to extinguish that flame. Instead, it gave Brigid a new identity. She became St. Brigid of Kildare, said to be a nun, an abbess, and a founder of monasteries. Her sacred flame continued to burn, but now it was tended by Christian nuns, and her miracles were attributed not to divine femininity, but to the power of Christ. The goddess didn't disappear, she was simply given a new title. Brigid's feast day, February 1st, coincides with Imbolc, a pagan festival marking the beginning of spring, dedicated to fertility, renewal, and the returning light after winter's darkness. The festival remained, but its name changed, its meaning redirected. Yet beneath the surface, Brigid's ancient roots remained firmly planted. This was not an isolated event. Across Europe, the same pattern unfolded. Gods and goddesses woven seamlessly into the Christian framework, their stories reshaped, but their essence remarkably intact. Consider St. Nicholas of Myra, a 4th century bishop from what is now modern-day Turkey. The historical Nicholas was known for his generosity and kindness, a protector of children and sailors. But as his legend grew, it absorbed older myths, becoming something far greater than a bishop's biography. In Northern Europe, St. Nicholas's image merged with the figure of Odin, the chief god of Norse mythology. Odin was known for riding across the winter sky on his 8-legged horse, Sleipnir, during the wild hunt, a spectral procession of spirits and gods believed to bring both blessings and dread. Odin, with his long white beard, his wisdom, and his role as a giver of gifts and knowledge, bore striking similarities to the evolving figure of Nicholas. Even the tradition of leaving out shoes or stockings to be filled with gifts traces back to offerings left for Odin's horse during Yule, the midwinter festival celebrating the rebirth of the sun. Over time, these traditions blended. The fierce god of the stormy sky became the jolly, gift-bearing figure we now know as Santa Claus. But the shadow of the wild hunt still rides with him in folklore's undercurrents. The transformation wasn't limited to individuals. Sacred sites too were absorbed and repurposed. Pagan temples didn't always fall to ruin. Many became Christian churches. The stones remained, but their names changed. In Rome, the Pantheon, once dedicated to all the gods of the Roman Empire, was consecrated as a Christian church in the 7th century, rededicated to St. Mary and the martyrs. Its architecture remained, its grandeur untouched, but its purpose realigned to fit the new faith. This strategy served both practical and spiritual purposes. It allowed the continuity of sacred spaces, comforting converts with familiar rituals and locations, while reinforcing the supremacy of Christianity. Why destroy a temple when you can sanctify it? Why erase a god when you can canonize them as a saint? Even the Christian calendar was shaped by this process. Feast days often aligned with pagan festivals, creating a seamless transition from old beliefs to new ones. All Saints' Day, celebrated on November 1st, was positioned to coincide with Samhain, the Celtic festival marking the end of the harvest and the thinning of the veil between worlds. The ancient festival's rituals, honouring the dead, lighting fires, wearing costumes, persisted, rebranded under the Christian lens as part of All Hallows' Eve, or what we now call Halloween. This was the genius of early Christianity's expansion, not through simple destruction, but through adaptation. The faith absorbed the power of the old gods, transforming them into saints, angels, and holy figures, their divine essence hidden just beneath the surface. So when you hear the story of St. Brigid or sing songs about St. Nicholas, you're not just hearing Christian tales. You're listening to echoes of older voices, whispers from gods whose names may have changed, but whose stories still endure. But not all divine figures were absorbed quietly as saints. Some took to the skies, clothed in radiant light, their wings spanning cultures and centuries. We call them angels now, messengers of God, warriors of the heavens, beings of pure spirit, but their origins stretch back to a time long before Christianity, their forms shaped by civilizations that gazed at the same stars and wondered about the beings who might dwell beyond them. The idea of angels didn't emerge fully formed within the Christian tradition. Their roots twist deep into older soil, influenced by ancient Persian, Mesopotamian, and Greco-Roman beliefs. One of the earliest and most profound influences comes from Zoroastrianism, an ancient Persian religion that predates Christianity by over 1,000 years. In Zoroastrian cosmology, the divine realm is populated by the Amesha Spentas, benevolent spirit beings who serve Ahura Mazda, the supreme god. These spirits embodied virtues like truth, justice, and immortality, acting as intermediaries between the divine and the human world. Their roles as guardians and cosmic warriors left a clear imprint on early Jewish and Christian thought. In fact, the very concept of a spiritual hierarchy, a structured order of celestial beings, has striking parallels with Zoroastrian beliefs. The rigid angelic hierarchy found in Christian theology, with its distinct orders of angels, archangels, thrones, dominions, and powers, mirrors the tiered cosmic order of Zoroastrian cosmology. The Book of Daniel, one of the earliest Jewish texts to name angels like Gabriel and Michael, was written during the Jewish exile in Babylon, a time when Persian religious ideas were woven into Jewish thought. Consider Michael, often depicted as a warrior archangel, clad in armor, wielding a flaming sword. He is Christianity's heavenly general, leading the armies of God against the forces of darkness in the Book of Revelation. But Michael's fierce, battle-ready persona echoes earlier divine warriors, gods like the Babylonian Marduk, who defeated the chaos dragon Tiamat in Mesopotamian mythology, or the Persian Mithra, a solar deity associated with covenants, oaths, and divine justice. Both Marduk and Mithra were cosmic protectors, standing as barriers against chaos, much like Michael in Christian lore. Then there's Gabriel, the Archangel of Annunciation, whose name means God is my strength. Gabriel appears as a divine messenger in the Bible, delivering revelations to Daniel, foretelling the birth of John the Baptist and announcing the coming of Christ to the Virgin Mary. But the archetype of the divine messenger isn't unique to Christianity. It echoes the Greek god Hermes, the swift-footed messenger of Olympus, guide of souls, and intermediary between gods and mortals. Hermes' role as a psychopomp, leading souls to the afterlife, also parallels Gabriel's function in Islamic tradition, where he delivers the words of the Quran to the Prophet Muhammad. Even the word angel comes from the Greek angelos, meaning messenger, which itself was a translation of the Hebrew malak. But these words describe a function, not a form. The forms, winged, radiant, fearsome, were borrowed and blended from cultures older than the faiths they came to serve. And if we ascend higher in the celestial hierarchy, we encounter beings that defy simple description, the seraphim and cherubim. In popular imagination, cherubim are often portrayed as plump, rosy-cheeked babies with tiny wings, innocent and harmless. But the cherubim of the Hebrew Bible are anything but childlike. In the book of Ezekiel, they are described as terrifying, hybrid creatures with 4 faces, that of a human, a lion, an ox, and an eagle. They have wings covered with eyes, and their bodies are radiant with fire. These beings aren't symbols of purity, they are manifestations of raw, divine power. The origin of the cherubim can be traced back to ancient Near Eastern mythology, particularly the lamassu of Assyrian art, winged human-headed bulls or lions that guarded the gates of palaces and temples. These mythic guardians symbolized strength, wisdom, and divine protection. Their imposing forms were carved into stone, standing sentinel at city gates, much like the cherubim were said to guard the entrance to the Garden of Eden with flaming swords after humanity's fall. Then there are the seraphim, whose very name means burning ones. In the book of Isaiah, the prophet describes them as beings with 6 wings, 2 covering their faces, 2 covering their feet, and 2 with which they fly. They surround the throne of God, their voices shaking the foundations of heaven as they cry, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts." These beings are not gentle messengers, they are blazing embodiments of divine fire. The seraphim's imagery likely draws from even older sources. In Egyptian mythology, the uraeus, a rearing cobra-like serpent, symbolized divine authority and fiery protection. It was often depicted on the crowns of pharaohs, representing the goddess Wadjet, whose fiery gaze could destroy enemies. The idea of divine serpents, radiant with power, slithers through many ancient cultures, from the Naga of Hindu and Buddhist traditions to the fiery serpents mentioned in the Hebrew scriptures. What's striking is not just the survival of these motifs, but how seamlessly they were integrated into Christian theology. Angels became the bridge between the earthly and the divine, but they carried with them echoes of older gods, spirits, and guardians. The fearsome cherubim, the fiery seraphim, the warrior archangels. They are the descendants of beings who guarded sacred spaces long before the first Christian church was built. Even in modern depictions, the influence persists. Stained glass windows, religious icons, and medieval manuscripts show angels with halos, a feature borrowed from depictions of solar deities like the Greek Helios and the Roman Sol Invictus, both gods associated with divine radiance. The very concept of a shining, radiant being descending from the heavens is older than any single faith. It is part of humanity's oldest stories, written in the stars and carried in our collective imagination. So when we speak of angels, we are not just speaking of messengers from the Christian God. We are speaking of beings shaped by millennia of belief, crafted from the myths and symbols of countless cultures. They are the echoes of older beings, their wings casting shadows that stretch all the way back to humanity's earliest attempts to understand the divine. But not all the old gods were granted the dignity of sainthood or the celestial glow of angelic wings. Some were cast down, their names blackened, their powers twisted into warnings. Where saints inspired devotion, these figures were recast as demons, villains in the new spiritual order. Their ancient strength became something to fear, their symbols turned into signs of sin and chaos. This wasn't merely about religious doctrine, it was strategy. When a new faith rises, it doesn't just need converts, it needs to rewrite the map of the sacred. What better way to diminish the old gods than to turn them into monsters? Take Pan, the wild god of shepherds and forests from ancient Greek mythology. Pan embodied the raw, untamed forces of nature, half man, half goat with horns curling from his brow and cloven hooves striking the earth. He was the god of rustic music, revelry, and the deep primal connection between humans and the wild. But his presence wasn't always comforting. The Greeks coined the word panic from the sudden overwhelming fear said to arise in lonely places, an echo of Pan's chaotic, unpredictable spirit. As Christianity spread through the Roman Empire, Pan's image lingered in the cultural consciousness, but instead of fading quietly, he was repurposed. His horns, once symbols of fertility and natural vitality, became marks of diabolical corruption. His goat-like legs, once a badge of his connection to the earth, became monstrous deformities. Slowly, over centuries, the horned god of the wild transformed into the horned figure of the Christian devil. It wasn't just Pan. Many pagan deities, especially those associated with fertility, sensuality, or the natural world, were rebranded as demons. Their festivals became forbidden rites, their sacred symbols painted over with warnings of eternal damnation. This reframing wasn't about theological nuance, it was psychological warfare. To sever people from their old gods, you had to make those gods terrifying. Consider Lilith, whose transformation is even more striking. In Mesopotamian mythology, Lilith was a complex figure, possibly a goddess or spirit associated with wind, storms, and freedom. She appears in ancient Sumerian texts as Lilitu, a powerful entity with both protective and destructive aspects depending on the context. She was fierce, independent, and untamed, qualities that didn't fit neatly into the patriarchal frameworks that later dominated religious thought. In early Jewish folklore, particularly in the alphabet of Ben Sira, Lilith evolves into Adam's first wife, created from the same earth as he was. Unlike Eve, Lilith refuses to be subservient. She demands equality, defies Adam, and ultimately leaves the Garden of Eden of her own will. For this act of defiance, she is demonized, literally. Lilith becomes a figure of dark seduction, a night-dwelling demon who preys on infants and tempts men in their sleep. But look closer and you see the same pattern. An independent female deity or spirit, associated with power and autonomy, recast as a villain. Her fall from grace wasn't about inherent evil, it was about control. Demonizing Lilith wasn't just a mythological revision, it was a cultural statement about the roles women were expected to play in a society increasingly dominated by patriarchal religious structures. The process wasn't limited to individual figures. Entire pantheons of rival faiths were reframed through this lens. In Christian demonology, names like Baal, Moloch, and Asmodeus appear frequently as demons, entities of malevolence and corruption. But these were once gods worshipped by neighboring cultures, deities of power, fertility, and governance. Baal, for example, was a prominent storm and fertility god in the ancient Levant. His name simply meant lord or master, but over time he became synonymous with idolatry and wickedness in biblical texts. By turning gods into demons, Christianity achieved something subtle yet profound. It didn't just destroy the old religions, it inverted them. The sacred became profane, the revered became reviled. This inversion served to solidify the new faith's authority, painting the spiritual landscape in stark contrasts: light versus dark, good versus evil, God versus the devil. This wasn't purely symbolic. The demonization of old gods often justified violent actions against their followers. During the early Middle Ages, pagan communities were labelled as devil worshippers, their practices condemned not just as heretical, but as actively evil. This made it easier to suppress indigenous religions across Europe through conversion campaigns, inquisitions, and outright persecution. But even as these gods were cast into the shadows, they never fully disappeared. Their symbols lingered, etched into stones, carved into cathedrals, hidden in folk traditions. Consider the Green Man, a figure found in countless medieval churches, his face peering from foliage, a remnant of pre-Christian nature worship hidden in plain sight. Or the Krampus of Central European folklore, a horned demonic figure who punishes naughty children during the Christmas season, an echo of older winter spirits rebranded but never erased. Even the modern image of the devil carries traces of these ancient gods. The horns of Pan, the trident of Poseidon, the wings of fallen angels, all stitched together into a figure meant to inspire fear. But fear, like faith, has a long memory, and beneath the surface of that fear is the outline of older beliefs, older powers. So the question isn't just why these gods were demonized. The question is why they refused to be forgotten. Perhaps because their stories still speak to something primal, something that can't be silenced by doctrine or erased by time. They are reminders that even in defeat, the gods endure, sometimes in the most unexpected forms. But the story doesn't end with gods transformed into saints, angels, or demons. Their echoes ripple through time, embedded not just in theology, but in the very fabric of culture, hidden in rituals, symbols, and collective memory. The transformation of these deities didn't just shape religion, it rewired the way entire societies experienced the sacred. At the heart of this transformation lies a profound psychological truth. People rarely abandon what connects them to the divine. When beliefs shift, the old doesn't vanish, it adapts. It lingers in gestures, in words spoken out of habit, in customs that survive even when their original meaning is forgotten. Consider the ritual of blessing objects, crosses, homes, even fields during planting season. This practice has deep roots in pre-Christian traditions. Ancient agrarian societies performed similar rites long before Christianity, invoking the favour of local spirits, gods, or the forces of nature to ensure a good harvest. In the Christian era, the gods and spirits were gone in name, but the ritual remained. A priest's blessing over crops echoes older invocations made to gods of fertility and the earth. The idea of sacred relics, bones of saints, pieces of the true cross, or vials of holy water, also carries echoes of pagan reverence for physical objects imbued with spiritual power. In the ancient world, amulets, charms, and talismans were common, believed to hold the essence or protection of deities. Early Christianity officially rejected such items as superstitious, yet the practice endured. The belief that holiness could be contained, touched, and carried remained too deeply ingrained to be fully erased. Architecture, too, tells the story of this continuity. Many Christian churches, particularly in Europe, incorporate labyrinth designs into their floors, not for physical mazes, but as symbolic paths for meditation and prayer. These labyrinths trace back to pagan symbols representing journeys through life, the cosmos or the underworld. Pilgrims walking these sacred paths, often unaware of their ancient origins, participate in a ritual older than the faith that rebranded it. Then there's the persistence of processions, solemn ceremonial marches marking holy days or honouring saints. Long before Christian processions wound through village streets, pagan festivals featured parades dedicated to gods, celebrating the cycles of the seasons, the harvest or celestial events. The act of gathering, walking together, singing hymns, and carrying sacred symbols taps into an ancient communal expression of faith and connection to something beyond the self. But why did these practices survive when the gods they honoured were condemned or forgotten? Because belief isn't just a matter of doctrine, it's emotional, sensory, embedded in the rhythms of daily life. Rituals create a bridge between the seen and the unseen, the mundane and the sacred. When new religions take hold, they often retain older forms because those forms resonate on a level deeper than conscious thought. They feel right, even when their original context has faded. Consider the way people mark thresholds, placing symbols above doorways from mezuzahs in Jewish homes to crosses or protective charms in Christian households. This practice dates back to ancient times when thresholds were seen as liminal spaces, vulnerable to both physical and spiritual threats. In Roman homes, small shrines called lararia stood near doorways to honour household gods who protected the family. In medieval Europe, the tradition morphed into chalking blessings above doors during Epiphany, invoking protection for the coming year. The names changed, but the instinct remained, to guard the spaces where the known world meets the unknown. Even the rhythms of time reflect this layering of beliefs. The 7-day week, for example, has Babylonian roots, tied to the 7 celestial bodies visible to the naked eye: the Sun, Moon, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, and Saturn. Early Christianity adopted this structure, sanctifying one day, the Sabbath, as holy. But the cycle itself predates the faith, a reminder of how deeply humanity's spiritual life is woven into patterns set long before. This blending isn't just historical trivia, it reveals something profound about human nature. The sacred isn't fragile. It doesn't shatter when new gods rise or old names are forgotten. Instead, it slips beneath the surface, adapting, reshaping itself to fit new stories, new symbols, new rituals. But this adaptation also left psychological scars. Demonizing the old gods didn't erase them, it created shadows. Traditions that once celebrated fertility, nature, or feminine power were reframed as sinful or dangerous. Yet even as they were suppressed, they survived in folk customs, in whispered stories, in practices dismissed as superstition. Consider the tradition of knocking on wood for luck. Its origins likely lie in ancient pagan practices where people touched trees to invoke protective spirits believed to dwell within. The Christian worldview had no official place for such spirits, yet the ritual persisted, stripped of its original meaning but still alive in everyday behaviour. Or take wishing wells found throughout Europe. These wells often sit atop ancient sacred springs where offerings were once made to water deities. Coins tossed into the water are modern echoes of those offerings, a ritual stripped of its religious context but not its power to connect people with the hope for something beyond their control. Even in death rituals, echoes of the past remain. The practice of covering mirrors after a death, common in some cultures, is rooted in ancient beliefs about the soul's journey and the dangers of lingering spirits. The mirror, once thought to be a portal to other realms, had to be veiled to prevent the soul from becoming trapped. Christianity offered new explanations, but the ritual remained because it addressed a fundamental human fear: the mystery of what happens after we die. So what does this tell us? It tells us that the sacred is not easily contained. It moves through time like a river, reshaping its course but never ceasing to flow. The old gods didn't vanish, they became part of new landscapes. Their voices softened but never silenced, speaking through symbols, rituals, and the quiet corners of belief where official doctrines rarely reach. Perhaps that's their greatest legacy. Not that they were worshipped under new names, but that they reminded us of something universal: the human need to connect with forces beyond ourselves, to find meaning in the turning of the seasons, the birth of a child, the passing of a soul. So did the gods truly die, or do they still walk among us wearing different names? Their temples may have crumbled, their statues weathered by time, but their essence lingers, in rituals performed without question, in symbols carved into stone, in stories whispered across generations. They are hidden in plain sight, woven into the faiths that claim to replace them, not as relics of the past, but as echoes that still shape the present. What we call sacred, what we fear, what we celebrate, all are touched by hands long gone, shaped by beliefs older than memory. Perhaps the divine never disappears, it simply changes form.